An aging concrete grain silo overlooking the American Falls Reservoir stands as if it were originally planned to be a lighthouse in a landlocked state. Truth is, that grain silo is one of the few remnants of old Idaho Falls. Where you see water used to be dry land filled with homes and businesses until the American Falls Dam was built in 1927. American Falls is one example of a drowned town. What is a drowned town? Well, let's let our guest introduce themselves to find out.
My name is Bob Reinhardt. I'm an associate professor in the Department of History and the School of the Environment at Boise State University.
Yeah, and you've got something really, really interesting. It's called the Atlas of Drowned Towns, and I had no idea that there were so many drowned towns in the United States. But let's start with, what is a drowned town?
Yeah, so for the purposes of my project, I consider a drowned town to be any place that was moved or eliminated to make way for the reservoir for a large dam. So this could be an incorporated town, a village, a ranch, tribal homelands, any place that now lies under the waters of reservoirs that supply water for hydropower or irrigation or for the purposes of flood control. And there are thousands of these places around the world, hundreds of them in the American West, which is where my research focuses on.
Yeah, and so I've actually taken a look at your atlas and I've kind of clicked around. Some of these towns really are extremely old. I think there was one in Texas that was around 200 years old. So, why did so many of these towns end up getting pushed out in favor of these reservoirs? Was it simply the West expanding into these territories? What was kind of the thought behind pushing out so many of these native or old school villages or towns?
Mhm. Well, the dam building boom in the United States was really during the 1920s, 1930s, some during the 1940s. Obviously, World War II got in the way of that, and into up until the 1970s. So, you know, in those decades of the 1920s to the 1970s, you have in the American West, especially, a huge dam building boom that is, depending on where you are in the West, it's either for the purposes of irrigation so as to provide, make the desert bloom, as the phrase went at the time, or increasingly for the purposes of hydropower and in the Pacific Northwest, flood control. And so that was what was driving a lot of this dam building in the American West during these dam building booms. And you see some of those same reasons, that same justification used for dam construction later on after that. Earlier dam building, such as what you see on the east coast of the United States, often that had to do with drinking water, providing drinking water supplies. Every place is a little bit different, but every big dam has usually like a main purpose and then subsidiary purposes. So, for instance, the dams that I'm focused on in the Pacific Northwest, specifically in the Willamette Valley, those dams are primarily flood control dams. But they also have purposes, including they generate a little bit of hydropower. Some of them also are used for water storage, that is, in some cases, for irrigation, recreation, pollution abatement. It just kind of depends on the time and the place, what the purpose of it was. But more, the broader idea with any of these dams is, and the places that were moved was, um, dam builders and their supporters identified these areas as some place that would be most convenient or most efficient or most effective for building a dam. And part of that calculation for efficiency and where would be a good place to build is, who can they move out without causing too much of an uproar. It's kind of a cost benefit analysis equation, and often these places were, these communities were relatively small. They were marginalized in one way or another. They had a relative lack of cultural, political, economic, and social power, and so it was relatively easy to say to them, "Sorry, but you're going to have to move."
Yeah, and it is really fascinating how many of these there really are. The number is really staggering. I think your map is very like easy and intuitive to use, and I would encourage anybody to go and check it out because it is really interesting. You've got these also in some of these towns, these supplemental documents that people can look at, like oral histories. Can you talk a little bit about why it's kind of needed to have these kind of documents attached to these towns? What does that do for their story?
Yeah, sure. And I apologize to your listeners. I forgot to give the pitch for the website name. The website is drownedtowns.com, so drownedtowns.com. And yeah, we have a few different features on that page, and the big one that you've already mentioned is the map that's there. And that map has icons representing towns, villages, places that were moved, the dams that were responsible for that, but then also pins representing different kinds of artifacts like what you've already mentioned, oral histories, but we also have photographs, personal documents, that is like journals and diaries and things like that, newspaper articles, official documents. All of that material is broadly the kind of material that historians use to help explain the past, to help interpret the past, to help to understand the past. And specifically for my project, which is focused really on the experiences of people that had to leave their homes, the artifacts that we choose to put on the website have a lot to do with trying to convey that experience and to convey the memories that people have and that they create about their lost communities.
What intrigued you so much about what got you interested in a project like this? Because this is a very niche topic that I feel like not a lot of people would even think of.
Yeah, well, that's part of the reason I got interested in it was that it didn't seem to me at the time, and when I say at the time, I'm talking about 20 years ago when I was a master's student at University of Oregon. I was writing my master's thesis, and that thesis focused on a series of communities on the west side of the Cascade Mountains, in the place called the North Santiam Canyon. And one of those towns is a town called Detroit. And Detroit was moved in 1953 to make way for Detroit Dam. I thought that was really interesting. And as I went on and started working on my PhD down at University of California, Davis, one of my advisors said, "Oh yeah, there's dozens of these places." And I was like, "Wait, what?" It was kind of like this almost throwaway comment, and that got me intrigued to try to pursue a more comprehensive look at these places that have been moved or eliminated to make way for large dams. It turns out that there is some really excellent research on individual communities, but there hasn't been anything done comparatively, sort of to say, how were these experiences similar or different? I also have a personal connection to it. My wife's family is from one of these areas, is from the North Santiam Canyon, and my wife's grandmother actually went to school in old Detroit. So she went to school in a place that is now underwater, at least underwater half the year.
Yeah, and so the town of Detroit, the one that you have a personal connection to, you mentioned that it's underwater for half the year. Does that mean that half the year people could like go and visit these buildings that are underwater, or how does that work?
No, no, they can't because, as is the case with many of these drowned towns, when the reservoir area was being prepared, the dam building agencies removed everything, not just buildings and foundations, but also trees. They would cut down as low as they can. And there's real practical reasons for this. You don't want that stuff, hitting a boat propeller or eventually floating up and then pressing up against the dam. So in the case of Detroit and in many, many other places, there's nothing really left there. Um, that's especially the case as you move into the 50s, 60s, and 70s, where the reservoir clearing processes are much more thorough. Earlier than that, and then with plenty of exceptions in other places, there are foundations at other places. There are, in fact, sometimes entire structures. So the one that comes immediately to mind is an old grain silo that peaks up out of American Falls Reservoir on the Snake River in Idaho. And you can actually go to Google Earth or Google satellite imagery, and you can see the little shadow of this 100, 200-foot tall grain silo that's still sticking out of American Falls Reservoir. That dam was built back in the 1920s. So The shorter answer is some of these places, there are still remnants that appear when there's low water. Many of them are totally missing and totally disappeared.
Okay, and so, what happened to some of these people that got displaced? Were they reimbursed at all? What happened when the, reservoir or the government came in and said, we're going to put a dam in here, you guys have got to go? What happened to the people?
Yeah. So, generally speaking, if someone owned property in that area, they were compensated for what was regarded as fair market value for that property. So, if it was, land plus buildings, there would be a full sort of real estate assessment that the dam building agencies would conduct, and they would say, okay, your property is worth X. Will you accept this payout? And generally, well, generally is a sort of a hard thing to say. People could say yes to that, or they could take the dam building agency to court to ask for more. Um, so, in the case of Detroit, a minority of people pushed back against the offer, and they would sometimes get a little bit more. Now, if you didn't own property, if you were, for instance, a tenant, if you just rented the place where you were living, you didn't really have any recourse to compensation. Eminent domain law in the United States is such that you don't really get anything if you're renting property. You're just given notice that you're going to have to move. The landlord, the person who owns the property, gets the payment for the property there. In other places in the world, I'm familiar with a couple of cases in Latin America where renters and tenants demanded that they be compensated in some way, um, and so you see that happen on occasion in other parts of the world. Sometimes people want to know, well, did people get a new town site? Sometimes, like in the case of Detroit, there was a new town that was created, but that was relatively rare. Most of the time, the simple thing to do, particularly with these smaller places, was just to pay people off and say, good luck wherever you end up going.
Gotcha. And were the ramifications of putting these towns in these kind of marginalized communities, were those effects more pronounced on the people there, or was it just kind of pretty even-handed across the board? Would you say?
Can you run that by me again? I didn't quite understand the question.
Yeah. So in communities that are particularly filled with marginalized communities, like black communities or
Mm.
Asian communities, were these ramifications more severe?
I would say that sort of generally speaking, the more marginalized the community, the easier it was for the dam building agencies to move them. But I haven't done yet a thorough comparison of, for instance, how much an indigenous community would have been paid, or the individuals within an indigenous community would have been paid for the land that they lost. That's one of the things that I hope that this project, as it builds out, will be able to do, is provide the data, the basis, the archival evidence for being able to do those kinds of comparisons.
Yeah, and so through your research currently for what you have access to, have there been any surprises? What have been some really surprising moments for you while you've gone through these various towns?
Yeah, well, I'm always delighted to come across records that reveal very emotional or strongly stated opinions by residents about displacement. And the spectrum is kind of all over the place. So there's two quotes that come to mind, or two examples that I want to give you that come to mind. One was from somebody who lived in Detroit, Oregon, who, when interviewed by a local paper, by the downstream paper, the Salem newspaper, said something like, "I'm looking forward to being moved." At that point, they had established there was a new town that had been established, and the woman said something like, I'm looking forward to moving up there. Here, everybody rents their property, and it's not very nice. But up in the new town, everyone's going to own, and it'll be nicely landscaped." So she was excited about the prospects. And then I think of another guy, and I actually can remember his name. His name's Alfred Jenks, and he lived in the area downstream from Dworshak Dam, which is on the North Fork Clearwater River in north central Idaho. And when he was interviewed in the 1970s, about 10 years after the dam went in, um, he had some very strong words. The interviewer asked him something like, "How did you feel about this?" And he said, "I hated it. It made me leave my home, everything that I ever loved." He had some really choice words about this process. So, um, I think those are the best kinds of records that I come across, are where people that had to leave the places that they had grown up in really clearly talked about how they felt about that.
Yeah, and this is a your map covers all of the United States, and then I think a little bit into Latin America, but I don't think it goes too far right now. Is there a way that people can get involved in helping you in your research, and how can
Oh
they
yeah.
go about doing that?
I'd love it. Yeah, no. So on the website at drowntowns.com, there is a feature up in the top right corner called Share Your Story. So people can click on that and they can send us any information that they want. It could be anything from I heard so and so, or even, I've heard that there's a place under this reservoir, and they just send us a note and we'll look into it. Or maybe they have artifacts, photographs, other kinds of materials that they'd like to share themselves, and they can do that through Share Your Stories on our website. That's the best way because it gets into our workflow. They could also email the project at drownedtowns@boisestate.edu. So I'll say that one more time: drownedtowns@boisestate.edu. That's our email address, and people can send in their tips, send in their suggestions. And if people really want to get involved, we've started these processes of collaborating with other historians and other history buffs, where basically I figure out a way of setting up a folder where they can upload material, and they can upload their own narratives and stories, which we then put onto the website. So one of the things that you can see right now that's starting to fill out on the webpage is Eastern Kansas. There's a scholar who works at a museum in Eastern Kansas, and she's been in contact with me and has just provided me, I think she sent me about 50 photographs, and we're uploading those right now. And she's also written a couple of interpretive narratives that we're going to be posting to the website. Her name is Claire Cox. She's a graduate of the University of Kansas, and she works at the Wakarusa River Valley Museum, I think is the name of the museum. So a variety of different ways that people can get involved, from just sending us a hot tip to becoming a collaborator on the project.
Gotcha. And are there any communities that you would particularly like to hear from? Any states that could use a little more fleshing out that you'd like to hear
Oh
from?
boy. Yeah, well, that's a really great question. I have become increasingly interested in filling out more of the international map. So you mentioned we have a little bit in Latin America. That's true, but there's so much displacement that has happened in Africa, in the subcontinent, in China, in Europe. I've become interested in that. Those are older stories, the ones in Europe, of displacement, that I've become interested in. So, for your listeners, I don't know. There's really no more or less important place, and I welcome information about places that aren't on the map, or places that are on the map that maybe we don't have it right. Please let me know.
Yeah, and it's a fascinating map. I've clicked around it. I've actually played on the map quite a bit and just
Cool.
looked around my hometown, and I'm like, "Oh,
Yeah,
wow, there's a lot of these."
yeah,
It is was it a little staggering for you to see how many there were?
yeah. I mean, that's really interesting. I think my awareness of the scope and scale of displacement has gradually built over time. When I started with it, I thought, oh, there's dozens of these places, because I know how many. I know about there being a lot of dams in the American West. And if you just start like thinking about it, well, those dams, if they have a big reservoir, then people might have lived there, and you just start thinking about it. So over time, sort of my awareness has grown. I think the things that are more surprising or interesting now are the extent of this in other places in the world. So I recently, maybe a couple, 3 months ago, I was contacted by the Australian Broadcasting Corporation a Sunday radio program. And they said, we've come across your website. I had recently published an article, and they wanted to interview me. And during that interview, they said, "Oh, and what, do you know about these places in Australia?" And they rattled off like a half a dozen different places. I was like, I did not know about those. Stands to reason, though. And sure enough, there's a lot of places in Australia that were inundated, that were displaced, that were eliminated to make way for large dams. So that's, I think those kinds of things are surprising to me, and a real delight to be able to connect the story to other places in the world.
Yeah, it is. It is really fascinating how one single type of construct, some the same type of building process, can lead to so many of the same results around the world. In 5 or 10 years, what do you hope the project looks like?
I hope that it is a self-sustaining and community collaborative project that provides the processes and the tools and the infrastructure for historians, history buffs, uh, the people that were displaced and their descendants to participate in um, further informing a broader public about the scale, the scope of displacement, and the meaning of displacement. I would love for it to become the place where people connect with each other about this topic, which is not to say that it's the only place people would learn about this. As I've mentioned, there are other scholars that have worked on the topic of displacement. For instance, I'll just give you one name, Erica Marie Busemic, who's at the University of Texas in Austin. She's written a delightful and fascinating book about Glen Canyon Dam on the Colorado and the long history of displacement involved with that. So I want people to read Erica's book, and then I want people to talk about Erica's book as part of the Atlas of Drowned Towns, and how to connect that book to upstate New York, where a scholar who just got finished her PhD at University of Pennsylvania, Anna Lair Musser is working on communities in upstate New York that were moved to make way for the reservoirs for water, for drinking systems. So if it can become the hub, but not the only place where people are involved in these conversations, that would be amazing.
Yeah, and do you think we've pretty well covered the drowned town aspects? Do you think there's anything we've missed when talking about this topic so far?
No, your questions have been great, and has provided me the opportunity to, get the word out about it. So the last thing I would say is go to drowntowns.com, check out the map, check out the archive, the directory, and click on share your story and share your story. And it doesn't have to be like I was born and raised in one of these places, but I've heard lots of other people say things like, when I was a kid, we used to drive by this reservoir, and my dad always used to say there was a place under it, and I don't know, maybe check it out.
Yeah, and so, Bob, if people have liked what you've been saying today, where can they find more of your work or get involved?
Yeah. So once more, a pitch for the website, drownedtowns.com. You can also find more information about me at the Boise State University's Department of History website, which is boisestate.edu/history. And if your listeners want to contact me, they can contact me and my team at drownedtowns@boisestate.edu. You can send me an email there.
I want to personally thank Dr. Bob Reinhardt for bringing this story to my attention. If you have any information to share with him, you can reach him at drownedtowns@boisestate.edu, which will be linked down below. And if you want to continue to support the show, give us 5 stars or a like or whatever, but mostly tell your friends. Until next time, this has been a story your city forgot.